Hey everybody, so here we are with Chapter 11, Preparing and Delivering Business Presentations. This is a much shorter version of the PowerPoint that we have of the book, and we're going to hit it right now and get through it hopefully in 10 minutes. I haven't been able to do it so far, but maybe this will be the first. We're going to start out with this. You remember this. ACE, the ACE process: analyze, compose, and evaluate. We start out by analyzing who our audience is, what our purpose is, and how we're going to send that message. Here's a list of things, and it shows, I think, how many things people think about before they, or as they're analyzing their audience. There are two things that really jumped out at me that we hadn't talked about that much. One is, who are the key players? Oftentimes in a business situation, there are people who are in the room who are more important than other people, frankly. There's the boss of the company. There's the division head. There's a person with expertise in whatever the situation is. So you want to know who they are, and you want to know who you've got to reach and how you're going to reach them. The other thing that I thought was interesting is this number 7. How far do you need to move them before they act? Whether you're doing a sales presentation or a persuasive presentation, or maybe just doing a feasibility presentation, there's an adage in sales that says, once you have the sale, stop talking. And I think the same thing is true when you're doing a presentation. Know exactly what you've got to do, or about what you've got to do, to move people to wherever you want to move them, to get them to the level of understanding you want, and then you move on. Analyzing your message. There's a thing by Aristotle, the Greek philosopher, who is called the 3 modes of persuasion, or the 3 means to persuasion. And it basically, Aristotle argued, in persuasive speeches especially, that you needed 3 things. You needed ethos, pathos, and logos. Ethos being, simply stated, goodness, the goodness of the speaker, the credibility of the speaker, the trustworthiness, and the likability of the speaker. And the idea is, if you didn't buy into the speaker, you weren't going to buy into his or her topic, his or her take on whatever they were talking about. And I think the same thing is true in business. Then there's pathos, which is the emotional component. If they don't care, they're not going to care. And the emotions are the way to get people to care, whether or not it's buying a car or adopting a program or adopting a highway. You want to get them to care, to get interested in it, and the best way to get people interested is to hit on their emotions. Finally, there's logos, reasoning. And reasoning, you think logical reasoning, that's the most effective thing, and the thing you need to push people over the top in a business presentation. Whatever you're going to argue for, you've got to make the point convincingly that this is the problem and this is why, this is the way to solve it and this is why, and this is how you're going to go about it, and this is what the result is going to be. And if you can't write that, then you're not going to make the point, and you're not going to be effective as a researcher in a research paper, and if you can't say it, you're not going to be a good presenter. So you want to be able to put all 3 of those together for every speech that you give. Analyzing your setting. This is important too. This is something I talk to public speakers about all the time. Are you going to be standing in a big room? Are you going to be sitting around a conference table? Are you going to be at a computer doing an online presentation? You want to think about how you're going to deliver the speech and how you're going to modify the presentation to fit whatever the setting is. This goes into medium options, how to deliver the message. It's figure 11.3, as I've said before. I really like the figures in the book, and this is one to look at. As you can see, there are a lot of different types of mediums that people might use, and this is the advantages that each has, and it's worth taking a look at, and it's worth, as you get into your career, practicing all of them, just to see which ones you get best at. How to compose the presentation. This is basically putting everything together in kind of the rough draft phase. You kind of identify how you're going to do it. You think about what's going to go where, and then you organize the content into an introduction that gets the audience interested in both you and the topic. And then you want to have the organization and the reasoning and the strong points right in the middle. And then finally, you want to have that strong conclusion, because as we've talked about in class, the last thing that you say is going to be the first thing people are going to remember about a good speech. This goes a little deeper into this. different techniques that people use to capture and keep the audience's attention. If I told you, for example, that 95% of human resource directors say that the most important thing in hiring and promoting prospects is public speaking ability and the ability to present, would that impress you? I totally made it up, but hopefully it got your attention. That's one of their recommendations. It's worth going through this and getting a good sense of what else they recommend. Standalone presentations, we talked about this with PowerPoint. The standalone presentation is basically the PowerPoint that you can just send it out, and it's really not necessary for you to listen to the speaker talk, because what he says is going to be, or she says is going to be right there on the slide. There are definitely strong uses for this kind of a PowerPoint, but what we usually talk about and try and get people to think about is the visual aid presentations. That's what they use in TED Talks. That's when they use a graph, a headline, fewer words to make more points. And really they're there to supplement what the speaker is saying, sort of like the speaker is the magazine article, and the slides are the pictures and the graphs, etc. that go with it. Designing individual slides. One thing to keep in mind when you're doing the slide for the visual presentations is slides are not a speaking script. There's nothing worse than to see a speaker who turns and looks directly at the slide and says, slides are not a speaking script. The less information, the more is absorbed. So keep that in mind. Don't stare at your slides, and don't put too much information on them if you're giving a visual presentation. This I included just because I see it so often. I think it's a fairly common mistake. When you use bullet points, what you want to do is you want to group things that they group together because they've got things in common. Like, for example, how many times do you see the speech and the speech says, Bolivia, major exports include, and then the first bullet says coffee, and the second bullet says tea, and the third bullet says discovered by Simon Bolivar. You want to basically group like things if you're going to use bullet points. Setting the stage. This is less about setting the setting and more about getting yourself ready and all the things that go into making the speech effective. Start with practice. Practice aloud. Say the words. They sound different when they come out of your mouth than they do in your head. Dress for the part. Some people say dress like the best dressed people in the room. Some people say dress like the top 5% of people in the room. Nobody says dress worse than everybody in the room. As a comedian, you can do it once in a while because it's your character. But as a business person giving the presentation, you want to think about what you're going to wear, and you're going to want to dress effectively and efficiently for whatever you're going to present. Arrive early, always a good idea. Make sure that the equipment works. Make sure that you're going to be able to stand in a spot where you're not going to be getting in the way of your screen. And just basically think about all the things that go into an effective presentation and control as many of them as you can. I don't usually let students do questions as part of the speech if I can help it. And when you do your presentations, because it's a timed speech, I would like you to ask questions at the very end, or ask for questions at the very end. But I wanted to include this just because it is pretty effective how they think about the question and answers here. And there are times that you're going to be giving presentations where questions are going to be an effective thing, particularly online if you're doing something technical. And it can be important to stop every few minutes and say, hey, is everybody okay? Does anyone have questions about this part? We're going to move on to the next thing. So a few things to think about. Decide how you're going to handle Q&A. Are you going to do it before? Are you going to tell people to hold it till the end? And be sure to tell the audience. Say, we're going to hold the questions till the end, or we're going to ask questions with every section. Let them know. Anticipate what the question is going to be so that you have the answers ready to go and you don't have to kind of think your way through it. And if you've got a team, that's a really good idea and a really good advice that they give in the book, which is if you've got a team, you want to think about what the questions might be and who is best suited to answer those questions. Because so often you see a team presentation and they get a question and they let somebody handle it, and maybe it would be more effective if the marketing person handled it instead of the technical person, and vice versa. The other thing about answering questions, and this is really good advice, is the three-part answer, which is to restate the question. Whatever the question is, you restate it. And the reason you restate it is that way everybody else in the room can hear the question, because maybe they missed it the first time. The second thing you want to do is you want to give headline responses, big answers. I heard somebody speaking for Joe Biden, and somebody said, how did Biden feel about the coronavirus? And the fellow said, how does he feel about the coronavirus? Restating the question, he said, he's against it. And he got a big laugh, and he made the point. And then he filled in the answer a little bit. And then the last thing he said is, have I answered your question? You're asking people, does that satisfy you? Should we move on to the next thing? And that gives people the chance to say, well, I want a little bit more information. Now, how do we adapt this approach for online presentations? Well, a couple of things. For one thing, you don't have to be too loud like you do in a room. You have to be loud enough that your microphone's going to be able to pick you up, and people can hear you, basically. And you want to think about the fact that it's you're now about the length of the camera to your face, away from the audience. You're going to have to think about the fact that you're not going to get feedback from the audience the way you do in a live room. There's no energy exchange in the live room. There are not a whole lot of nonverbal cues. So you want to think about basically the most effective way to deliver the speech, but a lot of it is the same stuff we've talked about. Having it written well, doing a little bit of rehearsal, anticipating where the questions might be, anticipating where you're going to have to be more clear. All of that. Somehow I came back to the front. That's perfect. Let me go back to the very end. This was going so well until just this moment. When we get to this. There you go. In a live presentation, managing the audience experience, this is really about how to present effectively. It's figure 11.28. It's got a lot of advice here. It's all really good advice. And it's got the do's and the don'ts. And one is, don't jump right into it. Give the audience a little bit of time. People are kind of tuning in. They're testing their mics. They're testing their buttons. Give them a little time to acclimate. And I know that there are some people who run meetings, and I had a friend who was an engineer, and she used to run a meeting, and she had engineers from all over the world would basically come in, come in from India and from England and from Scotland, and she'd be sitting there in New Hampshire in her jammies, and she would pretty much get everybody on board, say hello to everybody, and then they launched right in, and it was a very effective meeting. But you want to have that moment where people can get acclimated so that they're ready to go. And that's the advice for strong online presentations. Analyze, compose, and evaluate as best you can. Thank you.